Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into something I know a lot of you are really interested in: improving your English communication skills.
Yeah.
We've got this guide chock full of advice and tips, and we're going to go through it together and pull out like the really good stuff, the practical things you can actually, start using today.
Right.
But we're not just going to summarize, we're going to analyze why these tips work.
Yeah.
So think of it as like a shortcut to fluency.
That's a great way to put it. And what's really interesting about this guide is that it kind of approaches English communication as a journey, building from the ground up. And it might surprise you that the first step isn't actually about speaking at all. It's about listening.
I've heard that before, but it always seems so counterintuitive. Isn't the point of communication to get my point across?
Well, yeah, ultimately it is. But think about it this way. Have you ever been in a conversation where the other person was just waiting for their turn to talk?
Yeah.
And not really absorbing what you were saying?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
It's so frustrating. Active listening is the opposite of that.
Okay.
It shows respect, it builds rapport, and it lays the groundwork for a genuine exchange of ideas. Plus, when you're learning a language, active listening is kind of like downloading the source code. You're tuning into the natural rhythms and patterns of English, which is key for sounding more fluent.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like you said, building from the ground up. So how do we become active listeners, especially when we're still, kind of grappling with the language itself?
Well, the guide has some excellent tips for this. One that really stood out to me was immersing yourself in native English content. Think podcasts, audiobooks, YouTube videos, especially things like TED Talks or interviews where the focus is on natural conversation.
I do that all the time for entertainment, but I never really thought of it as actively training my listening skills. Usually I'm multitasking while I'm listening.
And that's where the active part comes in. Don't just passively hear the words. Try to really focus on what's being said, the tone of voice, even the pauses. The guide even suggests something called mirroring, where you repeat phrases you hear to internalize the natural sentence structure.
So it's like shadowing, but for listening.
Exactly.
Okay. I can see how that would be helpful, almost like training your brain to recognize those building blocks of English sentences.
Yeah, exactly. And the guide then segues into the next logical step, which is actually using those building blocks to build your own spoken English. Daily speaking practice is key, but it doesn't have to be complicated or require a partner.
So what are some ways we can practice speaking on our own?
One of the simplest yet most effective techniques, what the guide calls self-talk.
Oh, okay.
You literally just talk to yourself in English about anything. Describe your day, your thoughts, narrate what you're doing. Anything goes. Aim for 5 minutes every morning.
Honestly, I feel a bit self-conscious even thinking about that. But I guess the point is to just get comfortable with the sound of your own voice speaking English, right?
Right. It's about overcoming that fear of making mistakes and just letting the words flow. Another technique the guide recommends is recording yourself, giving short monologues.
Okay.
Choose any topic that interests you and just speak for a few minutes. Then listen back and see what areas you might need to work on. Pronunciation, grammar, even just the pace of your speech.
That's a great idea.
Okay.
Sometimes it's hard to be objective about your own speaking until you hear it played back. It's like having an instant language coach in your pocket.
Exactly. And speaking of coaches, the guide also suggests shadowing.
Right.
A technique you mentioned earlier where you listen to a sentence spoken by a native speaker and then immediately try to repeat it as accurately as possible, mimicking their intonation, rhythm, even their accent. Think of it as vocal training for English.
I've tried shadowing before, and it's definitely challenging, but I can see how it helps you internalize those subtle aspects of spoken English that are hard to learn from a textbook.
Exactly. And the guide emphasizes that even dedicating just 10 minutes a day to these speaking exercises can make a huge difference over time.
Wow.
It's about consistency and quality of practice, not necessarily quantity.
That is reassuring to hear. Sometimes the idea of becoming fluent can feel so overwhelming, but breaking it down into those manageable chunks makes it seem much more achievable. So we've got active listening and daily speaking practice as our foundation. What's the next layer we add?
Well, we've laid the groundwork for fluency, but now it's time to kind of expand your toolkit, and that starts with vocabulary.
Okay. I feel like everybody knows vocabulary is important, but the guide warns against the old school method of just memorizing word lists. What's a more effective way?
The guide calls it smart learning. It's all about being strategic and focusing on what matters most for you. Instead of memorizing random words, they say try thematic learning.
So if I'm really into tech, I should focus on learning tech-related vocabulary.
Exactly. Learning becomes much more engaging when you're passionate about the topic. But don't just memorize isolated words. The guide emphasizes learning words in context.
Okay.
So instead of just learning the word algorithm, you might learn it in a sentence like, "This algorithm helps personalize your news feed."
Oh, I see.
Not only do you learn the meaning, but you also see how the word functions grammatically. Plus, you're more likely to remember a word when it's connected to a vivid example or a topic you care about.
It's like the difference between seeing a word in the dictionary and hearing it used in an actual conversation. Context brings it to life.
Exactly. And to really lock those new words into your memory, the guide recommends spaced repetition techniques. There are great apps like Anki and Memrise that use this method to help you review words just before you're likely to forget them, making learning more efficient.
So instead of cramming a ton of words at once and then forgetting most of them, you're kind of strategically reinforcing your memory over time.
Precisely. And remember, quality over quantity. Even learning 5 new words a day and actively using them in your speaking and writing can make a huge impact over time.
Okay.
It's not about knowing the most words, it's about being able to use the words you do know effectively.
That's great. I'm definitely taking notes on this. So we've got our foundation, we're expanding our vocabulary. What's next on our journey to fluency?
Well, you could have the most impressive vocabulary, but if people can't understand what you're saying, it won't matter much.
True.
Next up, perfecting your pronunciation.
Yeah, pronunciation can be a real hurdle for language learners. Do I need to completely lose my accent to be a good communicator in English?
Not at all. The guide makes a really clear distinction between accent and pronunciation.
Okay.
While accents are a natural part of language variation, clear pronunciation ensures that you're easily understood. Think of it like this. You can have a beautiful singing voice, but if you're off-key, the song won't be very enjoyable.
Right.
Pronunciation is hitting those right notes in English.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So what are some practical ways to improve pronunciation?
The guide recommends a website called Youglish.
Okay.
You can type in any word and you'll hear it pronounced by native speakers in different accents and contexts.
Cool.
It's a great way to train your ear and hear how a word can sound in real-life situations.
I've used Youglish before, and it is amazing how much variation there is even within like American English.
Yeah.
But how do I actually practice saying the words correctly?
Well, the guide suggests focusing on what are called minimal pairs,
Minimal pairs.
which are words like ship and sheep that differ by just one sound.
Okay.
By practicing these pairs, you train your tongue and your ears to distinguish and produce those tricky sounds that can often cause confusion.
That's smart. It's like isolating the problem areas and then doing those targeted exercises. What else?
Another great tip is to record yourself saying new words and then comparing your pronunciation to that of native speakers.
Yeah.
You can even use Youglish to find recordings of the specific words you're working on. It's a great way to hear the nuances you might be missing and track your progress.
I love how this guide emphasizes self-awareness and actively analyzing your own speech.
Yeah, it's incredibly valuable for any learner. The goal is to be easily understood, not to completely erase your accent.
Yeah, that takes a lot of pressure off. Okay, we've got our foundation, we're expanding our vocabulary, we're working on pronunciation. What's the next level up?
This one is perhaps the biggest leap forward, but also the most rewarding. We're talking about training your brain to think in English.
I've heard that advice before, but it seems so abstract. Like, how do you actually switch from thinking in your native language to thinking in English?
Well, it might sound daunting, but the guide breaks it down into kind of manageable steps.
Okay.
Start by forming simple everyday thoughts in English without translation. So instead of thinking, I need to go to the store, think I need to go to the store.
So it's about incorporating English into my daily, like, mental routines, even for, like, the most mundane things.
Exactly. The next step is to start labeling objects around you in English. So while cooking, you might think, I'm chopping the onion. Or while getting dressed, I'm putting on my shoes.
It's like turning your environment into a language learning playground. Every object becomes an opportunity to practice thinking in English.
And the final step is to try to conduct your inner dialogue in English.
Whoa.
It might feel strange at first, but over time, it helps to kind of shift your default thinking language.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. Active listening helps you absorb those natural patterns of English. Speeding practice builds fluency. Vocabulary expands your toolkit. pronunciation ensures clarity, and thinking in English makes it all flow more naturally.
You got it. But remember, it's a journey.
Yeah.
It takes time and consistent effort to reach that level of mastery. The key is to enjoy the process, celebrate your progress, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way.
That's great advice. And speaking of the journey, where are we head next?
Well, we've been focusing on those internal aspects of language learning. But now it's time to step outside your comfort zone and put those skills to the test in real-world interactions.
All right, so we're back and ready to tackle the next stage of our English communication journey, practicing with real people. I have to admit, this is the part that makes me the most nervous.
I understand. It can definitely feel intimidating to put yourself out there, especially when you're not fully confident in your skills. But remember, the whole point of language is to connect with others, and the guide really emphasizes that real-world practice is where fluency truly blossoms.
So where do we even begin? The thought of just striking up a conversation with a native speaker is terrifying.
You don't have to jump into the deep end right away. The guide suggests easing into it with language exchange platforms like, HelloTalk, Tandem, or Speaky. These apps connect you with native English speakers who are learning your native language, so it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. You can chat, practice pronunciation, and even help each other with grammar.
That sounds a lot less intimidating than, say, trying to navigate a conversation at a busy coffee shop. Plus, I like the idea of helping someone else learn my language at the same time. Are there any other ways to find practice partners?
Absolutely. The guide also mentions online forums and local meetups dedicated to language learning. In-person meetups can be especially helpful because you get to practice those all-important nonverbal cues we talked about earlier.
Right.
Like eye contact and body language. Think of it like a gym for your communication skills.
Okay, that's a great way to put it. But even with those more structured settings, I still feel like I wouldn't know what to talk about.
The guide has some excellent advice for that too. They recommend using everyday situations as opportunities to practice. Think about the things you already do in your native language. Ordering food, asking for directions, even just making small talk with the cashier.
Oh!
Challenge yourself to do those things in English.
Because it's about turning those mundane moments into mini language lessons.
Exactly. Each interaction, no matter how brief, helps you build confidence and get more comfortable using English spontaneously. And you might be surprised by how friendly and helpful people are when you tell them you're learning English.
That's good to know. I guess I tend to focus on the fear of making mistakes, but maybe I should focus on the potential for those positive interactions instead. So we've got apps, forums, meetups, and everyday situations. Are there any other ways to get real-world practice?
Well, the guide doesn't specifically mention this, but I think it's worth considering. Immersing yourself in an English-speaking environment.
Yeah.
Now, I know this isn't feasible for everyone, but if you have the opportunity to travel to an English-speaking country, even for a short time, it can be incredibly beneficial.
I've always dreamed of traveling to, say, London and just soaking up the language and the culture. But even if travel isn't an option, are there ways to create a more immersive experience at home?
Definitely. You can surround yourself with English, media, movies, TV shows, music, podcasts, books. Try changing the language settings on your phone or computer to English.
Oh.
Even just exposing yourself to the language passively can make a difference over time.
It's like turning your daily life into an English language class.
Exactly.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the foundations of active listening and speaking practice to expanding vocabulary and pronunciation to thinking in English, and finally, real-world practice. I'm feeling much more confident already. But before we move on, there's one point I'm curious about that you mentioned earlier. Nonverbal communication.
Ah, yes, that crucial 70% of communication that often gets overlooked.
Right.
We've touched on it briefly, but it deserves more attention, especially when you're practicing with real people. Remember, communication isn't just about the words you say. It's also about how you say them and the signals you're sending with your body language.
So even if my grammar and vocabulary are perfect, if my nonverbals are off, my message might not get across?
Exactly. Think about it. If someone's telling you a funny story, but they're avoiding eye contact and their voice is monotone, is it going to be as funny? Probably not.
That's a great point. So what are the key nonverbal cues we should be aware of when we're speaking English?
Eye contact is a big one. It conveys confidence, shows respect, and helps you connect with the person you're talking to.
Yeah.
But don't stare them down. A natural, relaxed gaze is all you need.
Okay, so no laser focus. What else?
Facial expressions play a huge role in conveying emotions and adding nuance to your message. If you're telling a happy story, let your face reflect that joy. If you're expressing concern, your expression should match.
That makes sense. I guess it's about being congruent in your communication, letting your words and your nonverbals kind of work together to create that genuine connection.
Exactly. And don't forget about your tone of voice. Varying your pitch and volume can make your speech more engaging and help to emphasize certain points.
Yeah.
Think of it like adding punctuation to your spoken words.
So instead of speaking in like a monotone, I should use my voice to bring my words to life.
Exactly. Imagine you're telling a story. Would you read it in a flat, emotionless voice? Of course not. You'd use your voice to convey excitement, suspense, humor, all those elements that make a story captivating. It's the same with spoken English. Let your personality shine through in your voice.
This is all so helpful. I'm realizing that mastering nonverbal communication is just as important as mastering grammar and vocabulary. It's about becoming like a more well-rounded communicator.
I'm glad you're seeing the connection. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more crucial element the guide highlights: the power of simplicity.
You mean like keeping my sentences short and sweet?
That's part of it, but it's more about approaching communication with clarity and conciseness as your guiding principles. It's easy to get caught up in trying to sound impressive with complex vocabulary and grammar, but often the most effective communication is the simplest.
So it's about getting my message across clearly without like all the bells and whistles?
Precisely. Think about the times you've been confused by someone using overly complicated language. It's frustrating, right?
Oh, yeah.
The goal is to be easily understood, not to show off your vocabulary.
Okay, I can definitely see the value in that. What are some practical ways to keep our communications simple and clear?
Well, the guide has some excellent tips for this.
Oh.
First, try using short, direct sentences, especially when you're explaining complex ideas.
Yeah.
It helps your listener follow your train of thought without getting lost.
So it's like breaking down a big, complicated machine into smaller, more manageable parts.
Exactly. It makes it easier to understand how everything fits together. Another helpful tip is to avoid filler words like and, These words can make you sound hesitant or unsure of yourself. The guide suggests practicing pauses instead, allowing yourself a moment to gather your thoughts before speaking.
Oh, I am so guilty of using filler words. I never realized how much they weaken, the impact of what I'm saying. I'm definitely going to work on those pauses.
It might feel awkward at first, but those well-placed silences can actually make you sound more thoughtful and deliberate. It's a technique often used by, public speakers to enhance their message.
Ooh. I'm starting to see how all these seemingly small details can make such a huge difference in how we come across as communicators.
Absolutely. And one final tip for clear communication. Use active voice whenever possible.
Okay.
Makes your sentences sound stronger and more direct. For example, instead of saying, "The email was sent by me," say, "I sent the email."
Okay, that's a simple change that makes a big difference. I'm definitely taking notes on all of this, so we've covered a lot of ground in this section. Real-world practice, nonverbal communication, and the power of simplicity. What's next on our journey?
Well, we've talked about practicing, but practice alone isn't enough. To truly improve, we need to be open to feedback and actively work on refining our skills.
Ugh, I can already feel myself getting defensive. Feedback can be hard to hear, especially when it comes to something as personal as language.
I understand. But remember, feedback isn't about criticism. It's about growth.
Okay.
It's an opportunity to see yourself through the eyes of others and identify areas where you can improve.
Okay, that's a good way to look at it. So how do we get constructive feedback on our English communication?
The guide suggests recording your conversations and then listening back objectively, paying attention to areas where you might be struggling or where your message isn't coming across clearly.
It's like watching game film to analyze your performance. I can see how that would be helpful for spotting patterns and identifying areas for improvement.
Exactly. The guide also recommends seeking feedback from friends, tutors, or language partners. Choose people who will be honest but supportive, offering specific suggestions rather than just general praise or criticism.
So instead of saying your English is great, they might say, "I noticed you tend to use the present tense when you should be using the past tense."
Exactly. That kind of targeted feedback is much more helpful for making concrete improvements.
Okay, I'm starting to see the value in feedback, even though it might be uncomfortable at times. But what do we do with that feedback once we have it?
That's where the real work begins. The guide recommends creating a list of common mistakes and then actively working on correcting them through targeted practice.
Okay.
For example, if you keep mixing up the past and present tenses, you can focus on exercises that specifically target that grammar point.
It's like having a personalized training plan for your English skills. I'm feeling much more motivated to embrace feedback now. It's not just about hearing what I'm doing wrong, it's about using that information to get better.
Exactly. And remember, even small improvements add up over time. The key is to be patient, persistent, and most importantly, kind to yourself along the way.
That's such great advice. I'm already starting to see how all these pieces fit together to create like a roadmap for fluency. But before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I think we need another quick break. We'll be back in a moment to explore the guide's insights on mindset, motivation, and the bigger picture of what it means to master English communication. All right, welcome back. So we covered a ton of really practical strategies for improving your English communication, but there's one aspect the guide touches on that I think is key for like tying it all together: mindset.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the mechanics of language learning. Grammar rules, vocabulary drills, pronunciation practice. But the guide wisely points out that your mindset plays a huge role in your success.
I can definitely relate to that. Sometimes I get so focused on what I'm doing wrong that I forget to like celebrate how far I've come.
Exactly. And that negativity can really sabotage your progress.
Oh.
The guide emphasizes the importance of kind of shifting your perspective from "I'm trying to learn English" to "I'm an English speaker." Even if you're not fluent yet, embracing that identity can make a world of difference.
You know, I've actually noticed that when I start thinking of myself as someone who speaks English rather than someone who's learning it, my confidence really increases.
Yeah.
It's like I'm giving myself permission to make mistakes and just focus on communicating.
That's exactly it. It's like taking ownership of your language journey. You're no longer a passive learner. You're an active participant in the world of English communication.
That's a great way to put it. But even with a positive mindset, there are still going to be challenges, right? Like days when you feel stuck or frustrated or like you're not making any progress.
Absolutely. Language learning is a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
There will be ups and downs, plateaus, and breakthroughs. The guide reminds us to be patient with ourselves and celebrate even the smallest victories.
So instead of getting discouraged when I make a mistake, I should focus on the fact that I'm like putting in the effort and making progress, even if it's not always visible.
Exactly. Every time you use a new word correctly, every time you have a successful conversation, every time you understand a little bit more, those are all wins worth celebrating.
That is a great reminder. It's so easy to get bogged down in like the pursuit of perfection that we forget to appreciate the journey itself. And as you said, it's important to be kind to ourselves when we inevitably stumble.
Absolutely. The guide emphasizes that mistakes are an essential part of the learning process. They're not failures, they're opportunities to learn and grow.
It's like that saying, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? You can't expect to become fluent without making some mistakes along the way.
And when those setbacks do happen, don't be afraid to reach out for support. Talk to a friend, a tutor, a language partner, someone who understands the challenges of language learning.
Having that support system can make such a huge difference, especially when you're feeling discouraged. It's like having a cheerleader on the sidelines reminding you why you started this journey in the first place.
Exactly. And remember, there are countless resources available to help you along the way. From language learning apps to online dictionaries to pronunciation websites, the guide encourages us to use these tools strategically to supplement our learning.
We've talked about some great tech tools already, like Youglish for pronunciation and Anki for vocabulary. Are there any others that you find particularly helpful?
One that comes to mind is Grammarly. It's an AI-powered writing assistant that checks for grammar, spelling, punctuation, and even style errors. It's like having a virtual editor on hand at all times.
Oh, that sounds incredibly useful, especially for like writing emails or anything where accuracy is really important.
And of course, there's Google Translate. Now, it's important to use it judiciously. You don't want to become reliant on it, but it can be a lifesaver when you need to understand a word or phrase quickly.
I've definitely been guilty of overusing Google Translate in the past, but I'm starting to see it as more of a tool for comprehension, not a replacement for actually learning.
Exactly. Use it strategically to supplement your learning, not to avoid it.
Okay, so we've got a positive mindset, we're embracing mistakes as learning opportunities, we're building a support system, and we're utilizing tech tools to our advantage. What else does the guide highlight in terms of the bigger picture of English communication?
Well, it briefly touches on something that I think is incredibly important: cultural awareness.
Oh, yes. Language and culture are so intertwined.
Hmm.
It's not just about knowing the words, it's about understanding the context in which they're used.
Exactly. The guide reminds us that communication goes beyond just grammar and vocabulary. It's about understanding social norms, customs, and even humor, which can vary greatly from culture to culture.
Yeah, I can definitely see how a lack of cultural awareness could lead to misunderstandings, even if your English is technically perfect.
Absolutely. So as you continue on your English journey, try to learn about the cultures of different English-speaking countries. Watch movies, read books, listen to music, even try different cuisines. The more you immerse yourself in the culture, the better you'll understand the nuances of the language.
That's great advice. It's like language learning becomes a passport to exploring the world and connecting with people from all different backgrounds.
Exactly. And speaking of connecting with the world, the guide doesn't explicitly mention this, but I think it's worth reflecting on. How might improving your English communication open up new possibilities in your personal or professional life?
That's a great question. It could open doors to new career opportunities, make travel more enjoyable and enriching, allow you to connect with people from all over the world. It could even empower you to share your own unique voice and ideas with a wider audience.
The possibilities are truly endless. So if you continue on your English learning journey, keep those possibilities in mind.
Yeah.
Let them fuel your motivation and inspire you to reach new heights.
That's such an inspiring message. It's not just about learning English, it's about unlocking your potential and expanding your horizons.
And remember, every step you take, no matter how small, brings you closer to realizing that potential. So be patient with yourself, be persistent, and most importantly, enjoy the journey.
That is such great advice. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of improving English communication skills.
It's been a fascinating exploration.
I really hope you feel energized and equipped with the knowledge and strategies you need to achieve your language goals.
Well, remember, consistency, persistence, and a positive mindset are your keys to success.
And don't be afraid to embrace the journey. Enjoy the process of learning and growing, and celebrate your victories, big and small.
And never stop exploring the power of language to connect, to inspire, and to create.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, happy learning.